Should you buy a rebuilt or salvage title vehicle, or would it be one of the worst mistakes of your life? Well, today, Case and I are going to go over all the ins and outs to help you determine if it's right for you.
To get through everything you need to know about salvage and rebuilt title vehicles, we are first going to tell you what makes a vehicle a salvage title vehicle in the first place. We'll define the difference between salvage title and rebuilt title. We'll talk about what you need to do if you're shopping for a rebuilt or salvage title vehicle, what that ownership experience is like, specifically with a Mazda 3 that has a rebuilt title that Brendan owns. And we'll also talk finally about pricing and how much cheaper some of these vehicles can end up being.
Yeah, but first, let's start off with defining what a salvage title vehicle is. So a salvage title vehicle is generally a car that has been totaled out, and that could be for a number of reasons. Generally speaking, it's for an accident that caused a lot of damage that exceeded the value of the vehicle, but it could also be things like flood damage, which is something I would not go for. But it could be something as simple as like hail damage, which generally is just cosmetic.
Yeah, even cosmetic things that seem pretty minor like that can add up enough to total out a vehicle with insurance. And if that's the case, then one of those vehicles might be something that's potentially not that bad of a buy.
So you have two different title types. You have the salvage title versus the rebuilt title. And the salvage title is a vehicle where the state has determined that vehicle to not be roadworthy. And so if you buy a salvage title vehicle, generally you have two options. You could either A, part the vehicle out because it has value in parts, or you can try and repair it to make it roadworthy. And if you do repair it to make it roadworthy, you can then try and get it inspected by the state. And so once the state inspects it and deems it to be roadworthy, it can then be issued a rebuilt title.
Yeah, so there is a difference between a salvage title and a rebuilt title, and that's a pretty important difference because you need to have a rebuilt title if you want to go about registering that vehicle and actually driving it and using it. And what you're going to need to pass in terms of the inspection is going to change depending on where you live. But here in the state of Colorado, there's a pretty long list of things that they look for in that inspection to give you that rebuilt title.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking they do inspections on things as little as like the wheels and tires, the mirrors, the windshield. They want to make sure that it has, and this we're quoting this specifically from the Colorado DMV website, sufficient horsepower to operate with the normal flow of traffic, and then all parts must be attached by welding and brackets or bolts. Yeah, so I mean, they get pretty in-depth with their inspections. So if you're buying a vehicle that has a rebuilt title, especially if it's been recently issued rebuilt title, generally speaking, it's going to be a roadworthy vehicle.
Yeah, it should be at least. It's assuming that they did a pretty solid inspection on it, but they do look for at least some quality in the repairs because one of the criteria here in Colorado is no torn or jagged metal, which of course, if you repaired something poorly, there might be. And that's one of the things that they are supposed to check for.
Yeah. So let's say now that you have decided that a rebuilt title vehicle is right for you and you want to know what should you be looking out for. And like I mentioned earlier on, flood vehicles are the types of vehicles that I generally would avoid. I mean, there's always exceptions to the rule, of course, but generally speaking, those can be some of the most problematic rebuilt title vehicles you can buy because when you have automotive electronics and you add water, you're going to have odd problems throughout your ownership of the vehicle. And I think flood vehicles are one of the things that I generally avoid. But here's some of the things to look out for when shopping for them. If you see like sand or silt in the trunk, if it has wet carpets or like a musty odor to it, that generally says that it's a flood vehicle. And something else worth mentioning too is what's called title washing. So a lot of times you can have a clean title vehicle in your state that was previously issued as a salvage title or rebuilt title in another state, and that person doesn't disclose the issues, and then it doesn't get reported when the new title is issued in the new state. So you definitely want to keep an eye out, even for cars that have a clean title, for some of those issues that I mentioned.
You can also look at the bodywork of a car, and if you see a lot of gaps or things that don't quite line up, then there might be an indication that some of the repairs done were possibly subpar. And another really important thing when you're looking at one of these vehicles is trying to get as much of the history of the vehicle as you possibly can.
Absolutely. I mean, generally speaking, you want to run like a vehicle history report before buying a vehicle if you have that opportunity. And that is probably even more prevalent in rebuilt title vehicles because you want to know specifically why that vehicle was rebuilt and how it was rebuilt. And you want to try and get as much documentation around that as possible. And that usually starts with like a Carfax or a vehicle check of some sort. And then hopefully the person selling the vehicle also has supporting documentation of the repairs that were done. I know they certainly will need that supporting documentation to get a rebuilt title issued from the state. So especially if it's a vehicle that's been rebuilt recently, if they don't want to show you that paperwork, I would get the sketchy vibes because they had to show that paperwork to the state. And so they generally will have it, and they're just choosing not to show it to you, which is definitely a big red flag to me. And one other thing I want to mention too is uneven tire wear. Uneven tire wear is a good indication that you've got like some sort of frame damage or other damage that is causing those tires to wear unevenly.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something that's going to affect the way that it drives. It's obviously going to affect safety. So it's something that you also want to look out for. But all that being said, it is possible still to get one of these rebuilt title vehicles or salvage title vehicles and it not be a bad thing for one of the reasons that we'll talk about at the very end of this video, which is price, because you can get them for a lot less money than a vehicle with a clean title. But let's look at a specific case of one of these vehicles that we have in Brendan's 2013 Mazda 3.
So I actually purchased this rebuilt title Mazda 3, and this is a 2013 Mazda 3. And well, it made sense for me, but actually for the majority of you and anyone that I like, I would tell you to run away from this one.
Well, Brendan, this car is a lot nicer on the inside than the outside.
Yeah, clearly somebody, I mean, this thing looks like it's been in a destruction derby, to be honest with you. There's really no nice ways of talking about the outside, but the inside of this has been fairly well maintained. This kind of vehicle, generally speaking, for someone that's like the first time buyer of a car or first time buyer of something with a rebuilt title, I don't know that I could recommend this one, Case.
Yeah, you know, it's an example of a vehicle that you can get for not a lot of money, and this particular rebuilt title vehicle drives actually really well.
It does drive really well, which can be a little bit deceiving. So when you get out and, you know, test drive this car, it'll probably impress you as, I mean, it's impressing me. I drove it an hour into work today in the snow, and it performed great. I mean, the heated seats on it work well, the heater works well, the radio works well, everything on it actually works. But when you start to look at the details of this one, you'll see that it's got huge panel caps, especially up by the hood. And to me, that kind of tells me that this vehicle was not really repaired properly, and that's causing that panel gap up front because, you know, if something was lined up the right way, you shouldn't have it be that bad.
Yeah, this car looks like it's been run into every hard surface in the state of Colorado, but it does drive fairly well. So if you wanted to get a vehicle for a lot less money than something with a clean title just to bum around in, you don't care about running it into the ground, you just need it to last you for a certain amount of time, get you from point A to point B, and you don't want to dump a bunch of money into it, it could be a good runabout. But
it could be, but here's the other thing. The other reason why this particular one I wouldn't recommend, because it has been salvaged twice.
Oh,
and it's like,
that's not great.
Yeah, so I pulled the Carfax and it shows a salvage originally in 2016 when this car was only 3 years old and fixed in California, which that would actually to me bode well for the car because I'm like, oh, it was fixed in 2016 and it's been on the road since, so clearly it was fixed well.
Yeah.
But then again in 2019 in Colorado, it was salvaged again from an additional accident.
Yeah,
and man,
that's not a good sign.
It's bad enough you're buying a car that's been rebuilt once, but twice, I don't know.
Just another example of why it's a good idea to do your research on the history of a vehicle, because this is a particular case where, sure, like you said, if it had just been salvaged and fixed once, maybe not a huge deal, but it happening twice, yeah, that's not ideal.
No, it sure isn't.
Now, finally, for the biggest upside of buying one of these vehicles, which is how much they tend to go for. So, Brennan, usually when you're shopping around and you see vehicles that don't have a clean title, something with a rebuilt or salvage title, like what we're talking about, what is typically the price difference?
Well, let's talk specifically about this Mazda 3. So, if you were to have this on a retail lot with a clean title in good condition, you're talking like a $6,000 to $7,000 vehicle because of the newness of it and, just the fact that it's got a lot of good features going on. But because it's got a rebuilt title, you can be saving up to half off that price. So you're talking a vehicle that's going from $6,000 down to $3,000. And now because mine is a little bit on the rougher side and it's been rebuilt twice, I actually bought mine for $700. So in that instance, I think it was actually a pretty good deal for a running and driving vehicle for $700, even though it's kind of an ugly one. If you don't care about the looks, it might be a decent vehicle to drive around. But like I said, generally speaking, you can save up to 50% off on the price of a vehicle, and usually in most instances, it's at least 20% less.
Yeah, which could be a considerable upside for someone who's just looking for a cheap vehicle to get them around. They don't care about pouring a ton of money into it. They don't need it to last them for the next 20 or 30 years. They just want something to get from here to there for as little money as possible. A vehicle like that Mazda for less than $1,000 could be the exact thing that you're looking for. And it's also worth mentioning the insurance aspect of this. So some insurance companies won't insure vehicles that have rebuilt titles. Other companies will just offer liability insurance. But at the end of the day, you can get a rebuilt title vehicle insured so that you can register it, drive it around on the road if, again, you want something that's just very cheap, that you can run in the ground. My personal bit of advice would be if you do buy something that's got a rebuilt title, try to avoid pouring a bunch of money into it. Just go ahead and drive the wheels off of it until it quits. Because if you pour a lot of money into it, you're not going to see that return on investment. Anything that doesn't have a clean title is going to have a cap on how much it'll ever be worth.
Well, and that's certainly something to consider. Whenever you do go to resell that rebuilt title vehicle, they are generally more of a challenge to sell because you have to do a lot of explaining as to why it's rebuilt. People will want to see documentation, and people are just going to be generally a bit more hesitant, as they should be, on a rebuilt title vehicle. So keep that in mind when you go to buy it, that it's going to be a more challenging vehicle if you want to sell it down the road. So I would say that owning one isn't necessarily for everybody, but for some people out there that have a really limited budget on cars and still want to have something newer, a little more modern, it might be a decent option to get you into a car you otherwise might not be able to afford. But keep in mind that there could be extra costs down the road if you don't do your due diligence before you buy it.
And again, the biggest thing there is to just be at a point with one of those vehicles where you're comfortable in knowing why you think it was totaled out by insurance in the first place, and that is not going to affect what you want to do with that vehicle. So kind of what we talked about before, making sure that you get as much of the history as possible and you inspect the condition of it mechanically as much as possible. A situation where if it's mostly just cosmetic damage that totaled it out, it really could be not a bad decision.
Absolutely. Well, guys, I hope you guys found this informative. I know we just wanted to bring something a little bit different to you guys here in case you are out there shopping for something like this in the market. Either way, thank you guys so much for watching.